Welcome everyone to another episode of our Conscious Conversations series. I'm your host, Peter Daniel. This evening, I have the pleasure to introduce our guest for this week. A surprise guest. We weren't going to have another show after doing Shaman last week, but I really wanted to touch on some of this COVID and pandemic nonsense, and I've been looking for someone to ask, particularly someone local. And then Nick from PANDA jumped up on my radar. Thanks, Nick, for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Peter. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
So I'll just get a little intro and then we can get right stuck into the content because I'm sure we have a lot to cover. I think most of the people on this call have some idea of the silliness of the whole situation worldwide. I say silly facetiously, it's obviously a very serious situation, but it certainly takes a little bit of, it takes a bit of awareness of health and to give you an idea that there's a little bit more going on than what's being told in the mainstream media. I've been doing health interviews for the whole year, focusing on different aspects of keeping yourself healthy and well, pandemic or none. And I really wanted to get stuck into some of the stuff around lockdowns and the pandemic. So, I've used your website, PANDA, since you started it. Thank you so much for that. We're going to get into that in a minute. So that's a really great resource. I have put the link in the chat screen for those who'd like to head over there and have a look. But maybe start by going like lockdown happens, you see it, you go, this is insane. What motivates you to start PANDA?
It took us all a while to figure it out. And I went through a couple of weeks of intense anxiety, watching what was happening and kind of reading it with the help of some friends, in particular, a doctor friend of mine, Dave Carman, who lives in Sydney. And I became very unsettled by what I was seeing. It seemed completely wrong. It didn't make any sense that these countries were beginning to lock down. It was so obvious that the lockdown would be a cure worse than the disease. And we were skeptical about the benefits of lockdown even. And I was anxious for a couple of weeks. And then I worked out why. Because I saw in it, we saw in it, the potential for an end to life as we know it, a sort of calamitous existential crisis for freedom and human agency. And I guess it comes down to something that's quite sentimental, really, but sometimes sentimental things are deeply true. I didn't know how I would be able to look my children in the eye if I didn't do everything in my power to prevent them from being unable to lead the kind of life that I had led. It was as simple as that. And once we realized that, well, there was no stopping. Then it was going to be all out.
Sure. It reminds me of a video I watched last week of Dolores Cahill. I think she was in Dublin doing a speech on the street. And what is the quote she kept saying over and over again? Something like, all it takes for tyranny to succeed is for good people to stand around and do nothing.
Exactly.
So why PANDA? Why get into looking at the data? I mean, how do you even start? I'm a researcher. I'm looking at numbers. I'm on multiple Telegram groups, WhatsApp groups. I'm overloaded every single day. Even just finding the truth in that haystack.
Yeah, it's not all about the data. I mean, we've had a name for it simply because we, by being forced to, ended up producing some models which were accurate. And we are on top of the data because it's one part of the science. Our aim was to replace what we saw as incredibly bad science with good science. And we stick to that. And we've tried very hard to always just be saying, but wait a minute. Look, this is what we see. This is how it works. This is what the science said before coronavirus, before everybody went crazy. And just keep on saying that. So we do occupy a role that has some advocacy to it, but we try to not make it political. And so we're okay with being known as the data guys, even though there's more to it than data. But we saw it as important that there should be a voice that was uncompromised by government pressure, corporate capture, unafraid to speak out where we thought we needed to speak out, because most of the scientists in this game are in one or another way severely compromised.
Well, it's compromised, and if they're not compromised, they severely censored. I mean, it's pretty brave to step out, you know,
Yes.
as so few people have in the world, really.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that those scientists who would have every excuse for staying quiet, you know, because they are, in fact, at some level of analysis compromised, but nonetheless who speak out are the bravest. They're braver than anybody in PANDA. Well, sorry, there are some of those scientists in PANDA, but they're braver than me, because they don't face the loss of everything in their careers and their livelihoods. Sorry, they do face the loss of everything in their careers and their livelihoods in a way that I don't, you know. There a fair proportion of the PANDA members are people of independent means, but there are a good many scientists there. Some of them have to remain as covert members, so they give us their perspectives and help us through the science. But there are others who, like our advisory board members, you know, Sunatra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff. There's 6 of them now. I won't rattle off all the names, but I mean, they're all speaking out at great personal cost, you know?
Sure. Yeah, and it's good to just let that sink in for everyone. You know, there are people whose livelihoods depend on the work that they do, and in a world that's so heavily government, corporate controlled, when you step out of the narrative and you start saying something counter. I mean, I've been saying counter narrative to health from the start. You know, the idea of eating McDonald's taking you into your 80s is clearly insane. So I'm kind of used to that kind of world of going, hang on a moment, health is about something else. Let's get that straight. But yeah, very brave people. I mean, at the moment, we have the World Doctors Alliance that's just been created. I mean, there's hundreds of doctors on there. They recently put out that video, just every single one of them saying that the vaccine is dangerous, it hasn't been tested, this is not a pandemic. I mean, that's again, a very brave thing. And more people are now coming forward. And I think it's because we've had time. And so it's becoming more and more obvious the numbers aren't there to back up all the hysteria. So, I mean, you spoke about models, the initial models from the UK and then from the States and then South Africa, wherever they borrowed theirs from. How is it that your modeling is more than 10 times accurate than all of those guys?
Yeah, I mean, it is a lot more accurate. We're within 1% after 8 months on our 9 months almost on our original model. And, you know, what were the important things? We were looking at the international data and not trying to build an ant farm where you built what's called a causal model, where you try and explain every single phenomenon in the chain of infection and put a parameter on every one of those phenomena. We thought that was never going to be a successful enterprise. Complexity will fool you all the time. And there are all sorts of feedbacks and conditionalities and differences from country to country that you can't possibly take into account. And so we took a higher level approach, looking at the totality of the international picture, and working with one of our advisory board members' models, a very simple model called the Gompertz curve, which is in a way at one level purely descriptive. It doesn't pretend to cite any causal drivers. But at another level, it actually does. By implication, there are a bunch of things that it says about the way the epidemic generates. Wouldn't want to get into those because they're kind of deep in the philosophy of statistics and mathematics. But we took that approach of really paying attention to what the world was telling us. And we took that simple curve structure and trained that curve to what we were seeing in the international data in terms of what the drivers of mortality rates were. And that curve, we actually updated it, and the update is slightly worse than the original, but it's performed very well. Of course, knowing how many people are going to succumb to an epidemic is a tiny portion of the question of answering the question, what should you do about it? And we tried to stay out of the modeling game entirely, but with the models going so bizarrely wrong and the modelers refusing to listen to the points we were making, which were really 4 big points: that the fatality rates were much lower than they were assuming, that this idea of universal susceptibility was completely and utterly wrong. It was, zero susceptibility is closer to the truth than universal susceptibility. That they were grossly overestimating the duration to peak, and later on that they were missing the concept of seasonality, which is so important in respiratory viruses. These are the points we were making. They were ignoring them. They were persisting with these models that were resulting in massive misallocation of scarce healthcare resources. So we had to do something, and we built a model. But it was a small part of what we were saying. The major part of what we were saying was that nobody was paying attention to the collateral damage of lockdown, which we thought would be 30 to 100 times greater than anything the disease could ever bring. And later on, as we added more scientists on and started getting into the bowels of epidemiology, we actually came to a very astonishing conclusion, which is that even quite basic epidemiology will tell you that in the face of an age-graduated disease, one where the mortality rates are really heavily age-oriented, as they are for coronavirus. For a young person, the mortality rate is 1,000th what it is for an old person in the face of coronavirus. Where the mortality rates are graduated like that, lockdown is actually expected to worsen the overall fatality outcome. And that is a very, people are surprised to hear that, but it's actually a very basic principle in epidemiology. Professor Gupta told me last weekend before, I asked her, when would you typically teach this? And she said, undergraduate. It's not complex stuff for epidemiology. And it's interesting how we came to that answer. We noticed again in the international data that lockdown didn't seem to be having an effect on mortality. It did no beneficial effect. And as we got into more and more sophisticated statistical techniques for looking at the intercountry experience, we started seeing that lockdown was actually worsening mortality. And then we started asking why. And the epidemiologists who weren't captured and who weren't under the thumb of government said, oh, but, of course, when you reduce the mobility of the non-vulnerable population, it shifts the disease burden onto the elderly, and things will get much worse.
Sure. It makes me think of a meme I recently saw. It said, if the first lockdown worked, why the second one? If the first lockdown didn't work, why the second one?
Oh, it's terrible. I sometimes get, very often get sick to my stomach when I think about what we've done. We've managed to not only worsen the impact of the virus, but this approach towards non-pharmaceutical interventions, but we have cast people into poverty by the hundreds of millions, and poverty kills. It's just quite ghastly when you think about it, and still fills me with just the sense of dread as to what is going to come, because the effects of coronavirus will have long since disappeared when we are still grappling with the effects of the massive shock to people's livelihoods and to human agency. I think that in and of itself is a deadly thing.
I recently saw a stat that up to 41% of small businesses in South Africa are already gone. Yes,
that's broadly accurate. If you'd spoken to me 2 weeks ago, I would have been able to rattle off the statistics. They're not in my brain anymore, but the truth is not too far from that. And I can't stand that, because I've my career outside of PANDA is in private equity, and I do that career because I love working with the entrepreneurs and builders of businesses in the middle market. And so it's all those guys. Fortunately, our portfolio has done very well because we have a very resourceful bunch of people who run the companies, and they've dealt with things just astonishingly well. But sure, what's happened to people who run restaurants and travel businesses, and it doesn't stop there. It goes on and on. It's just quite terrible.
And maybe what people don't realize is those sorts of events are quantifiable in years of life lost. Your initial document that you produced was amazing in comparing years of life lost from lockdowns versus the virus. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It was such a reflexive, conceptual place for me to go to, because by training, I've never worked a day in my life as an actuary, but by training, I'm an actuary by qualification. And that's completely commonplace to do a calculation relating income to mortality. It's one of the oldest observed effects in life insurance mathematics, is that if you want to know what a person's life expectancy is, start by asking their age and their income. And so you can, let's not pretend that these calculations are incredibly accurate. They're accurate enough to make sure that the insurance companies don't go bust. And so you can use them, and we did. And we just showed that if you shut down the economy for the number of months that was being contemplated at the time, which is about 2 months back then, not the 6-7 months story that we've been living through, that it would have, an effect of approximately this much. And we took a conservative approach. We tried to cast lockdown as having the largest plausible benefits and the smallest plausible economic impact. And on that basis, we came up with the answer that there would be 30 times as many years of life lost to lockdown as to the disease.
That's your conservative number. What was your?
100 was I always said 2 orders of magnitude. I wrote a letter before even we did that paper. I wrote a letter to the NICD, just trying to get their attention and say, hold on, are you sure you want to do this? First of all, your 357,000 death estimate is way out. Look at the numbers coming out of the Diamond Princess cruise ship. Look at the numbers coming out of Europe. It's more like 10,000. Okay, so I was out by a bit, but much closer than 357. And look at the impact. You could lose, and I gave them the calculation using 100 times and just doing a back of the envelope kind of calculation. I said, you're going to lose 1 million years of life to the lockdown. Are you sure you want to be doing this? I never got a response. And I copied that letter, wrote, personalized it and sent it to NGOs all over the place, to university departments. And then Peter Castleton, one of the other early members of PANDA, came to my attention on Twitter, of all places. And he was saying exactly the same thing. He'd come to the same conclusion. In fact, very much the same numbers, both on the coronavirus deaths and on the lockdown consequences. And after begging twice by direct message, he finally paid some attention to me. And that was 5 days later, we were producing that, we were actually publishing the first version of that paper.
Oh, amazing. And so you've obviously put this paper under government noses and officials, and you're quite into the whole try and wake people up, including things like court cases. I mean, how's that all going? I read today that DISA pulled their case. Was it just delayed?
They're saying that they're going to go again in January. We had joined that case as what's known as amicus curiae, Latin for friend of the court. And that's a position we are happy to occupy when people bring cases. So I'm hopeful that case or a successor will replace it in January, because there's no basis, there's no rhyme or reason for doing what the government's doing. It's destructive, nothing more.
And I mean, the other person in that case was Rayner from the LFN. I mean, he's already won a case.
Yes, he's already won a case. I think the government got a big fright when they saw us coming, and they should, because there's no substance behind that. We know that. We've met with the NICD and quizzed them as to the pronouncements they make around the effectiveness of lockdown, and they have no answers. They're just mealy-mouthed about it. We know, that they don't have a scientific basis for what they're doing, because we've seen what the science is, and the science is exactly the opposite. So I think they're scared, and they should be. I would like to see the end of it very soon. I think our case had a lot to do with the very early announcement of this extension. 2 things. They came really early. They came in 2 weeks before the extension date fell. Then just before our court case was due, they came out and extended again, So that was the first time that's ever happened. And the other thing that was noteworthy is that the president did it, not the Minister of Cogta.
Okay. Well, I'm very pleased that the rule of law still has some some weight in South Africa? I mean, places like England in their second lockdown, surely they are on similar numbers where that's insane actions too.
Yeah, the law acts too slowly to make a difference in this kind of situation. This is a very unusual one. And I think we're going to need some constitutional changes. And I think PANDA will be around to try and make sure that we get some constitutional court cases going to make sure that lockdown is never possible again, and to support other people in other countries. I mean, PANDA is now a fully international organization, so we don't only do South African work. You know, it's a minority of our work now. We've got a lot of international scientists on board, brilliant people. And I think we'll be carrying on this fight for a long, long time.
Sure. Yeah, the idea that a government can take away your fundamental human freedoms and rights because there's flu going around seems pretty insane.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy. And to do it when the basic epidemiology says that what you're doing will actually kill people, you know, it's beyond insane. But there's been a lot of pressure. You know, it's not only the South African government. That's why we went international, was we realized that as long as the World Health Organization was providing air cover for this insane, deadly overreaction, and as long as there were organizations like the Gates Foundation, and you know, other governments were listening to them, the South African government had air cover, all the air cover it wanted, and it was not about the science. Politics was ruling. So we went international and put together our scientific advisory board with an amazing group of professors. I mean, top people in their fields. Yeah, and we're taking the story international. It's the only thing to do.
That's fantastic. You know, for people who are thinking, wow, you know, we're not being very thoughtful of all these people that have died from this supposed flu. I heard you mention in one of your other interviews some statistics around hospital bed use in South Africa and how that's gone. I don't know if you've got any of those at the top of your head, but I found it quite amazing.
Well, it's one thing that I've found particularly hard to deal with is the number of people who misconceive what we're doing. And I think it's done deliberately by some of the corrupt scientists who we are fighting against. You know, our message is not that we want to stop doing something that saves people. Our message is that lockdown doesn't save people and it involves a lot of collateral damage. So I keep on getting this reaction, oh, you don't care about the people who are dying from COVID. And nothing could be further from the truth. We're trying to minimize that damage as well as the damage of lockdown. And we don't believe that policy is at all good at doing either. And so I get this, you don't care about the frontline doctors, you don't care about the people who've lost loved ones, all of that kind of thing. And it's just false. You know, we're not in this for any monetary gain, that's for sure. It's not pleasant to work the hours that we work and have worked for many months now, when we've all got day jobs and everything. We're not in this for some kind of self-benefit, and we're not in it because we're crazy, evil people who want to see people die. You know, that should be obvious by now, and yet we get it almost on a daily basis. You know, and I think what happens is people are subjected to fear for so many months, and they actually lose their minds, and they begin to believe that lockdowns save people, and in a very basic way. And so when they hear somebody speaking out about lockdowns, they hear you're trying to kill people, which is the opposite of saving them. And then that very short kind of hysterical mental process plays out and ends up with mud throwing at PANDA, you know, something like that. Sure. I need to speak to more psychologists to understand exactly what motivates it, because there's no basis to it, you know.
Stockholm syndrome ranks high up there. Good batch of cognitive dissonance. Way too much watching the news probably helps.
Interesting you say that. I stopped watching television more than 20 years ago.
Yeah, likewise. Exactly 20 years.
Yeah, and almost stopped reading newspapers. Have you come across the concept of Gell-Mann amnesia? Mm-mm. So Murray Gell-Mann or Gell-Mann, I'm not too sure how you say his name, because there's a European version and an American version. But he was a great physicist. And he had this concept that when he read an article that was about physics in the newspaper, he would always go, wow, this journalist really doesn't know a thing. And this article is terrible. And then one day he realized that maybe that's the case for people in other disciplines. When they read an article in the newspaper, those articles are also terrible. And so he started asking a little bit, and he realized, yes, when you ask a person who's deeply steeped in subject matter, almost all of the content, whether it's political or scientific, in newspapers is terrible. And so I thought, okay, well, the TV's worse, but the newspapers also. Let's try and minimize how much everyday exposure I have to whatever it is that some journalist thinks I need to know about. And so I've had a discipline in life of trying to read old books, lots of old books that have been published 50 years ago and are still being read. That's a good sign, you know. And of trying to rather be steeped in the great literature, the great science, trying to read outside my own discipline as much as possible. I read furiously and have done so for decades now. And I think quite a lot of that is what also enables, and funny enough, there are other people in PANDA who are just like me, you know. But I think it enables us to take this generalist approach that you need to take when you're dealing with something as complicated as an epidemic, and to see not just the clinical things and the epidemiological things, but also the economic things and the cultural and psychological things that are going on. Yeah.
So, I mean, just following on from that, I don't obviously watch the news, but I have people who do, and then I'd say to them, so has anything been said about, you know, all the marches worldwide, millions of people saying this is rubbish? Nothing. Zip, crickets. Like, are you serious? They don't report on it at all in the mainstream media. And then someone sends me what can only be a genius piece of propaganda. I think it was Sky or CNN. It's like a 3-minute segment on Port Elizabeth and the unmarked graves being dug and people in hazmat suits. And I'm like, oh my gosh, if people watch this stuff, I'd be terrified if I watched this on the news.
Yes. You got to stay away from it. I mean, the other thing that really is the most spectacular one of all, 3 of PANDA's members are among the 20 signatories of what's called the Corman-Drosten Review. And it's a paper attacking the very foundations of COVID PCR testing.
Yes.
And if you read that paper, it's astonishing what they're saying. The ramifications of this are never ending. It should be the biggest news headline in every newspaper, on every television channel in the world the day it's published. And you have to scratch. I mean, there are a few articles that have been published, but not many. And it's going to be, they're kind of like, I don't know, saving up. What's going to happen is when that paper has its impact, people are going to go, what? You know, how did that happen? Because it's profound. You know, this is not just some minor comment about a detail in the PCR testing. It's pointing to major issues that affect most countries in the world in a very profound way. And indeed, the entire narrative about the epidemic.
Well, you see it right now. It's a case-demic. It comes in waves. The more tests, the more cases, the more fear. It's genius.
Yeah. Absolutely. Our government. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I wrote something right at the beginning of lockdown because my brother's in journalism, and we chatted. You know, the death of independent journalism was very clear from the beginning. You know, the government said you can only report on the coronavirus from our official sources, which is basically the WHO. So no one is technically even allowed to report outside of whatever they say. Exactly. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in Britain they actually have a surreptitious law about it. The BBC isn't allowed to report dissenting voices, and you know that is everything that is anti-science. The only way in which science progresses is by a process of evolutionary change, and in order to have evolutionary change, you need to have lots of trials, lots of different ideas. You know, if you take the analogy from biological evolution to the evolution of knowledge, biology works out by having lots of sexual recombinations or mutations at a genetic level that present trials of new versions of an organism, and those trials then either succeed or fail in the face of environmental pressure. Knowledge is no different. With knowledge, you come up with new ideas, new explanations for how the world works or some aspect of the world, and those ideas either survive refutation or they don't. And so if you cut off the trials, the competing explanations, then you get no progress in knowledge, and there's no culture of criticism and conjecture and criticism, and knowledge stops dead. You know, so it's a very disturbing emergent feature of culture that there is this censorship of dissenting views, and it's more than censorship. I mean, cancel culture is extreme. What's happened to some of these academics who've come out and said, hold on a second, the world isn't the way you think it is that their entire careers get ended.
Sure.
It's tragic.
Well, I think anyone watching this and just seeing how the narrative is almost verbatim repeated country after country, news station after news station, is aware there's something on a slightly larger scale than your local government putting in ridiculous laws. I suppose those can just be kind of maybe guessed at, and we don't have to go into it here. But certainly not listening to the news is going to help.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I always say people have sometimes used this label for us of conspiracy theorists. And I always say to people, I wish there was a conspiracy. It'd be a lot easier to deal with and to understand than what we're actually dealing with. What we're dealing with is a big problem that arises from over-centralization. You know, if you concentrate decision-making at too high a level in a hierarchy, it becomes sclerotic and stultifying. And you have these, it inherits a great deal of fragility. And so you get the World Health Organization having way too much say, and they say something and they don't admit criticism. And when that something is wrong, as it has been time and time again, then you have catastrophic outcomes. So it's a problem of centralization, not a problem of conspiracy.
And even organization like them, one day it's don't wear masks, they don't work. Next day, yes, you must wear masks. One day lockdowns work, next day lockdowns don't work. So
yeah, never with any evidence interjected in between. It's all political.
Sure. Politics, sure.
Yeah.
So what do you see in this next wave that they're trying to put on summer South Africa again, even though we're not in winter?
Yeah, look, I mean, there clearly are some outbreaks going on in confined parts of the country. And that's also one of the predictions of lockdown. You know, if you go and tell people to isolate, some manage and some don't. And wealthy people living in Knysna and Plet and in Sea Point manage. And then the virus is suppressed, but it never goes away. You can't make a widespread respiratory contagion like coronavirus go away. And so what happens is it erupts, you know, months later. We've got a brilliant modeler on our team by the name of Federico Lois, and he has actually managed to find ways of fitting models to predict exactly these impacts, where lockdowns are strong enough to actually make a difference. What happens is you get this emergent mortality later at a worse rate. So you will have these outbreaks. And those places would have been much better off if you'd taken a focused protection approach of saying, well, let's do the best we can to provide opportunities for the elderly who wish to isolate, the vulnerable who wish to isolate to do so, and everybody else go on with your normal lives, so that the brunt of the disease is borne by the people who are not vulnerable to it. It's such an obvious thing. It doesn't take a model to prove it, but he's actually found a way to and he's done it quite well. He knocked my socks off. When I first saw the model, he was predicting a resurgence in Spain that would be worse than kind of an endemic winter emergence. And that's exactly what they've had, you know. So, yeah, it's genius level work. I love it. He's a superb guy. Yeah, I mean, this is another one of the sad results. So now we have to have this going on 6 months after our peak.
So does his model take into account the negative effects of mask wearing and soon to be released untested vaccine on the populace?
So on the masks, what his model does is it takes into account relative mobility. And if masks work, which is a hugely controversial subject, then they have the effect of social distancing. So actually the same logic that I've just laid out to you right now is actually, it applies as well to masks. I say to people, we better hope that masks don't work, because we've had a mask mandate. And if they work, they will worsen the disease burden on the vulnerable. Again, it's an epidemiological finding, it's basic. So you kind of hope that they don't work. Federico's model works by generalizing across all of the social distancing things. So it's simple and elegant model that simply contrasts the mobility of the vulnerable against the mobility of the non-vulnerable. And it has one parameter which differentiates those two and then fits beautifully the emergent reality in the world. So, you know, again, there's the incredible virtue of simplicity and being able to actually fit to real world data is so powerful. So that's the one comment. When it comes to vaccines, it's very interesting listening to people. You know, people I don't think have a lively awareness that there are multiple vaccination strategies. When it comes to a disease like polio or smallpox, you're aiming for saturation vaccination and you're trying to eradicate the disease because it spreads according to different transmission mechanisms than a widespread respiratory virus. Respiratory viruses are known to cross back and forth between animal species reservoirs and humans. They're very widespread. There are ways in which they stay dormant. There are ways in which they transmit across large distances. It's an incredibly complex matrix. It's not all this simple, it doesn't all reduce to simple chain-based human-to-human transmission. So even with a vaccine, which, by the way, will wane in its effect over time, you're never going to eradicate a disease like coronavirus. That's not plausible. So you're faced with different considerations. And what you then are trying to do with vaccines is to protect the vulnerable, to try and give their immune systems a little bit of a smack on the nose. Wake up, here's a new thing that you need to learn how to look for, you know. And then if they do get infected, you hope that they have a lighter disease course or no disease course at all, that they don't develop the disease. And that's a more modest aim than what you're doing with smallpox. But people, I think, in their panic and fear, have, to the pharmaceutical companies' delight, assumed that what we're trying to do is the same as what we're trying to do with smallpox and measles, you know, which is to give every child a vaccination. But that would be a terrible mistake. There's a cost at every point. You've got to remember, it's not just benefits from vaccines. There are costs and benefits. And I'm not an anti-vax person. Just saying the simple point that there are trade-offs does not make you an anti-vaxxer. And one of the important trade-offs to understand is that it kind of occupies parking space in your immune system when you take a vaccine. You know, your T cells get mobilized towards the vaccine. And under normal conditions, that would happen because of infection, if you were infected. And the immune system's a finely tuned kind of, my colleague Dave uses the analogy of, it's a Swiss watch. And when you come with a vaccine, you're taking a crowbar to the Swiss watch. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. That's not to say that there aren't times when you need the crowbar, but you just got to understand that you're taking a very blunt instrument to a very finely tuned, infinitely complex one. I mean, as much as we know about T cells and B cells and about mucosal and humoral and cellular immunity, and its exquisite complexity, as much as we know about that, there's so much we don't know. And the complexity is staggering. We will be studying this thing for hundreds of years, thousands of years before we know the answers to any, you know, really great degree. I even doubt we ever will. It's so complex. It's the product of billions of years of evolution and an arms race, a permanent arms race between every living organism and every other one, between virus and bacterium and their hosts. And I just think people greatly underestimate the complexity of the systems that they're dealing with when they start meddling with the human body.
Absolutely. And when you take a big monkey wrench to a system that's already on shaky ground, as most people these days are, because people just generally aren't healthy. That would be my concern, really.
Yeah.
But anyway.
There's no question that there's some aspect to this of the condition of the population, that the higher mortality rates experienced in some places are owing to features of the population, obesity being one of them.
Absolutely. So you're going to be lining up for the vaccine then?
I definitely won't take the vaccine based on what I know now, which is that there are huge commercial interests involved and they've rushed the testing process. On that basis alone, I wouldn't touch it. I would much prefer to get COVID and recover because, at my age and in my state of health, that would be by some massive margin the expected outcome. I actually pointed this out, that if you want to prove relative safety, vaccine versus virus for young people, you'd need millions and millions of people in your trial. You couldn't do it, So all they're doing is they're saying, okay, well, we've given these people the vaccine and they haven't died from it, so it's safe. Well, but a lot of those people are people who weren't going to die from the illness. So you haven't proved relative safety. On that basis, I personally wouldn't take the vaccine. But I don't think it's a crazy idea for people who have vulnerability to take it at all. I'm not an anti-vax person. And I'm very disturbed though by the rush. And it's interesting for me that the Swiss authorities are saying not so fast. You've got to listen to them, because all of those authorities are under the same pressure from the pharmaceutical giants and from places like the Gates Foundation and the World Health Organization to vaccinate on a very wide basis. There are countries ordering stupid quantities of vaccines, putting their names in the queue. And that makes no sense. So I hope that there's an effective vaccine that can be taken safely by the elderly in particular, but also by people who have vulnerabilities of other sorts.
If you read a book like this, it might be backwards for you. It's
Cowan and Morrill. Okay, the contagion. Oh, okay. Maybe
taking apart the idea that viruses make you sick in the first place, but maybe for another talk.
Well, it's very interesting to discuss the causal structure of disease processes, because it's not just about the virus.
Sure.
It's also about the state of your system. And so it's hard in general, causality is a vexed philosophical concept. So it's very hard to do an attribution and say, Bob did it, Bob done it. I think there's obviously in the absence of the pathogen, you would have a different rate of death. So that's part of the causal structure. But when we look at metabolic health, that's part of the causal structure as well. And aging, immunosenescence, that's part of the causal structure. So it's complicated. Guess what? Welcome to the world. Welcome to human beings. Welcome to the human brain. Welcome to the immune system. They're all staggeringly complex systems.
And curious that worldwide flu rates have plummeted and all-cause mortality isn't showing a massive increase anyway.
Yes, I mean, well, look, you could clearly see the spike in the epidemic phases of this story and all over the place. But Sweden, the country about which so much gnashing and wailing has gone, is going to end the year with, mortality in line with 2018, pretty close to zero excess mortality, which tells you quite a lot.
I mean, in South Africa, can you even get those kind of numbers? I mean, I tried to look, and the website I found on government departments somewhere was 3 years outdated for mortality stats in SA. I mean, all the numbers we're getting saying so many people have died. I mean, do we know who those are? Do we know if they had comorbidities?
Well, our statistics are in a shocking state. And our all-cause mortality statistics are in a shocking state. It's estimate upon estimate. So our excess death numbers are extremely unreliable. And it looks as if we're going to have significant excess death for the year. And of course, the modelers who were greatly overestimating the whole thing are on a huge rush to persuade everybody that all those excess deaths are coronavirus deaths that weren't detected. Given how much testing we've done, that's implausible. Given how few anecdotes there are of people dying at home from COVID pneumonia, that's implausible. And they have every incentive to try and fill the gap in their models. So I wish people would listen to them a little less. Also, in other countries in the world, it's quite clear that there are lockdown-induced deaths and that they're big in number. Right now in the UK, the lockdown deaths are more than 100% of the excess deaths. In other words, the actual COVID deaths are less than a normal flu season. And the lockdown deaths make up that deficit and then some. So, it's really quite tragic what's going on there. You're just having people dying of non-COVID causes in their homes because they don't have access to the healthcare system. It's tragic.
Sure, crazy. So I'm sure people have a few questions for us. I think just to finish off, how would you suggest people get involved if they want to, I don't know, do something? I mean, for example, one thing I like to do when I go to town, because obviously to my mind, wearing a mask is ridiculous. It's called a face diaper. Cuts off your oxygen supply, brain damage within a few hours. So this is my mask. And when I feel, yeah, see, you can see me smile. I'm still a human being. I can talk clearly. You can hear me. And my other one, when I'm feeling really bling, is this one. Oh, it goes this way around. Very sweet. This one gets a few more looks. I really expected people would tune me about it in stores, but only one person did at a fish shop. But I carry the signed law that says any homemade item in South Africa. So if anyone does give me any flack, and I was in the police station for 4 hours a few weeks ago wearing this exact mask. Not one comment from one policeman. So what this does is it goes, it's all bullshit, and I'm following your stupid rules.
Yeah. I've tried the fat emperor's approach of smiling at people and saying exempt, and that's worked a few times. I only wear mine under gunpoint. I don't go along with the story of that it's an expression of solidarity.
Some of this curtain stuff. Yeah.
I'm getting restaurant envy here. But no, I mean, there again, it's the story of confounding people's intuitions. The idea is quite a simple one. You can see how it appeals to people, and you put something between. This is a virus spread by your breath. Therefore, if I put something between my breath and the rest of the world, I'll stop the virus. But it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, what stops a thing the size of a virus isn't that. So they say no, it's stopping the droplets. Yeah, okay. What happens to the droplets? Well, they sit on your mask, and then when you breathe in and out, they become nebulized. What happens to nebulized, aerosolized virus? It goes into your lungs instead of your throat. Well, that doesn't sound like a great idea. So just this pretense that there's solid science behind this absolutely asinine story, when there's actually real debate around whether even N95 masks work in surgical settings. So it's just catastrophically bad science. And I don't know if you saw the Scientist Collective article where they're arguing that the science was clear and that it's beyond debate that masks work. And they did that in the same week that the first randomized trial came out showing that there was no statistically significant effect. So it's quite pathetic, really, to see these scientists debased in such an extreme way.
Yeah. So besides getting yourself a bling mask, how else would you recommend people really start challenging the story?
Oh, sorry, that was your original question, and I got distracted by your wardrobe. Okay, so I mean, we can do with help of all sorts, just in promoting and amplifying our message. People who support us on Twitter, because we get these sniping people, and we can't pay attention to all of them. And having people who support us on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and promote our YouTube material, WhatsApp messages, all of that all helps. People who speak to their political representatives and draw us to their attention, that helps. People who speak to their companies and say, listen to these guys, that helps. We're also always in need of resources. If you've got lots of time and some skills that we can utilize, we welcome volunteers, because we are all working very hard, and the international aspect of this has added to that workload dramatically. So there are many ways to help, but above all, I think the most important thing people can do is to be compassionate about the people out there who have been scared, who are fearful. It is the most dispiriting feature of this government response, is that they deliberately set out to scare people and did a very good job of it. And I feel deeply for those people. I think we must all, it's one of the reasons why I don't throw around the name muzzles too often. I mean, it's what I think. Okay, I do think of them as muzzles and nappies and face diapers and so on. And I do think they're pathetic. But I don't think that the people who wear them are pathetic. They've been told that they're going to kill somebody if they don't wear them. And they're fearful of doing that. And that's not a bad thing. So I encourage people to try and be super empathetic, and to try and find ways to calm people's fear, to lead them gradually and gently towards the alternative views, towards the truth. and away from this dramatic narrative of impending doom.
And it's amazing to me just how people are held in mainstream media. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I would go down to Plett, my shopping, and I would notice, yeah, maybe like 30-40% of people were not wearing masks anymore. It was pretty relaxed. I mean, I never wear one in public. It's only when I'm stopped to go into somewhere that I put on my negligee. But it's just amazing. Now the news thing is going, oh, hotspot because we tested the sewage and there's COVID everywhere. So now everyone's wearing masks again. It's just bing, bing, bing,
Yes.
bing.
Yes, it is very much like that. And we had a fascinating discovery of that nature. When we were looking at, when we could see that lockdown stringency was having no effect on mortality, we asked ourselves the question, well, is mobility having an effect on mortality? And we couldn't see it. But in the process of trying to find it, what we found was that there was something that was driving mobility. And you know what it was? The daily death rate. About 2 days after deaths peaked, mobility reached its lowest point all over the place. So it was actually deaths driving mobility and not the other way around.
So the fear drives, it's crazy.
Yep. The news.
So stop being scared, people. Get outside, breathe the fresh air, do everything opposite to what you're being told to do. Likely healthier for you. Let's go through a few questions. We had a few coming through. Let's see.
Mobility. Yeah. So mobility. I'm sorry. It's a bit of a technical term. I should have explained that. When by mobility we mean how much people are moving around, and the way in which we can measure that is by looking at the cell phone data. So you can see how much people are on average moving, and infer from that how much they're interacting. It's not obviously not precise, but we have that data for every country in the world, other than China, I think.
So basically, for a fundamentally social creature, that's major nutrient is connectivity. When you disconnect that, you're going to see it breaking down. We had
in South Africa the largest decrease we found internationally in mobility. It was a massive smash. And you remember those days where there wasn't a single car in the streets. Yeah. Everybody was in their houses. We had a massive crash in mobility, yes. And yes, humans are fundamentally social animals. We do not do well psychologically when we're isolated. And I think we have done terrible things to people by isolating them.
Annette asks, are there any independent investigations regarding the alleged manipulation of cause of death on death certificates in South Africa? How is the cause of death actually determined for COVID positive patients?
Yeah, we've heard a lot of anecdotes about people who are clearly not COVID deaths being counted as COVID deaths. We are assured all the time by the authorities that there is a protocol in place. We've read the protocol. The protocol is not bad, but I doubt whether it's being applied properly. I would imagine that a lot of people who died incidental to a COVID infection and have gone down as deaths. This is where we have the information about other countries. You can see it's a massive factor. And interestingly enough, when people in places where they've curtailed testing, because with the testing being under so much scrutiny and threat right now, you see a sudden drop off in deaths.
Sure.
So that's going to be an interesting way to quantify this, because it'll happen in other countries. Yeah, I would suggest that anywhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of official deaths are not really COVID deaths in the typical country.
Sure. So at least in South Africa, hospitals and doctors don't get kickbacks for putting down COVID deaths as in America.
Yeah. In America, they get two types of kickback. The one is that they get a direct funding amount, and the other one is that they are exempt from liability for what's called a nosocomial infection, an infection that you pick up in a hospital. So if you go into hospital for a knee replacement and pick up COVID, the hospital doesn't face liability. But if you go into the hospital and pick up the flu, you face liability. And so that they've been exempted from that, and therefore they have a very strong incentive to classify any respiratory disease as COVID, and they're under no obligation to do any testing. They can just look at the patient and say COVID.
Sure. Bev asks, so what about the hype around vaccinations and it being compulsory? And it was just interesting as a note here. I read an article today where they're starting to pre-frame it already articles coming out saying, you know, if people die within 2 days of the vaccine, don't freak out. You know, it wasn't the vaccine. They probably were going to die anyway.
Yeah, like, you know, reversing the argument that we were making about COVID, actually, you know. In fact, one of our Facebook community asked a great question. He said, so now in the UK, are they going to describe anybody who dies within 28 days of a vaccine as a vaccine death? And it's a great question, because of course you aren't, but what it highlights is just the lunacy of doing exactly that for coronavirus. So we are firmly against mandatory vaccinations or any restriction on rights for people who have not been vaccinated. And if you put that together with what I was saying earlier about the nature of a sensible vaccine approach for a widespread respiratory virus, you will see that, you know, we really mean it. We really do not think that there's any purpose in vaccinating large swathes of the population, definitely not children. I would say that's a really dumb idea. That would be a health travesty. And ultimately, nobody should be forced to take medication of any sort. That is against the Nuremberg Code, and one that we should never allow. And I think we will be able to take on governments and organizations that inhibit people's rights by forcing vaccines upon them.
Sure, that's great news. You're well armed, Nick.
Not yet. We need a lot more funding. We need a lot more funding. I should have mentioned that earlier. We have a donate button. Please use it.
Fantastic. I have posted the PANDA website at the top for you guys to go and check out. Our time is up. We could carry on for hours. This was difficult and fun at the same time, Nick, as is the situation in the world right now, I suppose. Thank you so much for all of your inputs. Really appreciated it.
It's a real pleasure, Peter. Thank you for having me on, and thank you to all the people who logged on to listen to the story. And I hope you have a good festive season and avoid the dreaded lurgy.
I have recorded this, so if anyone on the call would like a friend or family member to check it out, it'll be available on our website in the next couple of days. And have a look at our past conversations. They are all very interesting and have something great for you. That's going to be it for us for this year. We'll start up again next year. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to having a lot more in the new year. Great, Nick. Have a lovely evening.
You too, Peter. Cheerio.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.